Owning a farm in a neighborhood that barely tolerates lawn gnomes? Yeah, I knew from day one that I was in for a fight. But I never expected that Margaret Maggie Sullivan would be calling 911 on my property, let alone that she'd end up being the one they came for. It all started when I inherited my grandfather's land, a sprawling 20-acre homestead just outside the city limits. The land had been in my family for generations, a quiet place where we grew produce, kept livestock, and lived peacefully. The farm sat on the edge of Willow Creek Estates, a high-end suburban development that prided itself on pristine lawns and uniform beige houses. While the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land, that didn't stop Maggie from trying to control it anyway. Maggie, the self-proclaimed lifelong leader of the HOA, had been a thorn in my side since I moved in. She hated that my homestead didn't match the HOA's approved aesthetic. My red barn, an eyesore. My vegetable garden, unacceptable. And my animals, a disgrace to the neighborhood. She tried every trick in the book to make my life miserable. First, she sent letters demanding I remove my fences, calling them an obstruction. Then she complained about the scent of fresh soil and hay, claiming it was offensive. She even went so far as to tell my farmhands that they weren't allowed to park their trucks on my land. But the real war started when she set her sights on my animals. It began with a petition to ban livestock. Maggie gathered signatures from her HOA cronies, demanding I remove my chickens, goats, and cattle. Her reasoning? They were loud, unsanitary, and disrupted the harmony of the neighborhood. Never mind that my land wasn't part of the HOA. Never mind that my family had been farming there long before the neighborhood was even built. When I ignored her ridiculous demands, she escalated. She filed noise complaints about my roosters, despite them being penned far from the houses. She called city inspectors, falsely claiming I was violating zoning laws. She even argued that my fencing blocked the neighborhood's view. Of what? I had no idea. When none of that worked, she did what every power-hungry HOA tyrant does when they don't get their way. She called the cops. I was in the barn when I heard the sirens. At first, I thought it was just a passing patrol car. But when two police cruisers pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly who was behind it. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on my jeans as two officers climbed out of their cars. Behind them stood Maggie, arms crossed, looking as smug as ever. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked, forcing myself to stay calm. One of the officers, a tall guy with a no-nonsense look, glanced at his notepad. "We received a complaint about illegal livestock and zoning violations." I sighed. "Let me guess, Maggie." Maggie huffed. "It's Mrs. Sullivan to you." And yes, I reported it. This farm is a nuisance, and it's time the law did something about it. The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, his property isn't under the jurisdiction of the HOA. According to county records, this land is legally zoned for agriculture." Maggie smiled, an unsettling, triumphant grin. "Oh, I think you'll want to look a little deeper," she said, pulling out a thick stack of printed documents. The officer took them, flipping through with a frown. I had no idea what she had cooked up, but I could already tell she thought she had me. I crossed my arms. "So what exactly am I being accused of?" Maggie's grin widened. "Oh, just a little thing called operating a commercial business without a permit." She had gone through every farm record she could find, digging for anything that could be used against me. She printed out listings for my farm's produce stand, claiming that because I sold vegetables, eggs, and dairy at the farmer's market, my property was now a commercial business requiring a different zoning permit. "This is a residential area," she said sweetly, "and commercial operations are strictly prohibited." One of the officers scratched his chin. "Selling at a farmer's market doesn't make this commercial property, ma'am." Maggie's face twitched. "Then how about the trucks?" she snapped. "The farm equipment? The deliveries? I have proof that large vehicles are frequently coming and going." At that moment, another car pulled into my driveway. But this one wasn't a police cruiser. It was a county-issued vehicle. Out stepped Richard Hale, a state agricultural inspector. I had called him the moment Maggie started escalating her attacks, and he was more than happy to set the record straight. Richard adjusted his glasses and approached the officers. "Gentlemen, I believe you're looking at a legal agricultural property under full protection of the state's Right to Farm Act. Mr. Whitmore is well within his rights to operate as he sees fit." The officers exchanged glances. "That settles it then. No violations here." Maggie's mouth fell open. But, Richard held up a hand. However, I do have some concerns regarding Mrs. Sullivan's complaints. We've received reports that she has been filing false claims and harassing a legally operating farm. That's a serious offense. The color drained from Maggie's face. By the time the officers left, she was seething. But for the first time, she was out of moves. And as Richard assured me, she was now the one being investigated. A few months later, the HOA had a new leader. Maggie had been forced to step down after an inquiry into her misuse of HOA funds. As for me, I kept running my farm, just like my family had for generations. And Maggie? Well, last I heard, she sold her house and moved to a different neighborhood, one without farms. Pictures of multiple work trucks entering and leaving the property. That's business activity, isn't it? I was getting tired of this nonsense. Maggie, those are farm supply deliveries. This is a working farm. You know, the kind that feeds people. But Maggie Sullivan wasn't listening. She was too busy watching the officers, waiting for them to say something that would validate her insanity. And then, just as one of the cops was about to answer, another car pulled up. Not just any car, a black government vehicle with tinted windows. Maggie frowned. Who's that? For the first time that morning, I smiled. Oh, Maggie, I think you're about to find out. The door opened, and out stepped a serious-looking man in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase. He walked straight past me, nodding toward the officers. Good morning, gentlemen. I was asked to come down here for a site visit. Maggie looked confused. Who are you? The man turned to her, his expression unreadable. I work with the state's Agricultural Protection Bureau. We received a report that someone was interfering with a legally protected farm. Maggie's smug look vanished. The officer holding her documents sighed, handing them to the new arrival. Sir, this is Mrs. Sullivan. She's the one who made the complaint. The man in the suit nodded. Thank you. I'll take it from here. And just like that, Maggie's entire plan fell apart. She stood there, mouth slightly open, clearly trying to process what was happening. She had expected the cops to shut down my homestead, issue fines, or maybe even force me to relocate my animals. Instead, she was now face-to-face with a state official, one who was here to investigate her. The officer from before, still holding Maggie's stack of complaints, handed them over to the man in the suit. Mr. Hale, she's been making a lot of claims about zoning violations, commercial misuse, and general nuisance complaints. Richard Hale, still unreadable, took a long look at the papers. Then he turned to me. Mr. Whitmore, you own this homestead, correct? I nodded. That's right. It's been in my family for generations. And you're operating under a legal agricultural exemption, correct? Correct, I confirmed. The county and state both recognize my land as farmland, and I have all the proper documentation to prove it. Hale turned back to Maggie. Ma'am, are you aware that this homestead is protected under the state's Right to Farm Act? Maggie blinked. The what? The Right to Farm Act, Hale repeated, his tone flat. It prevents local ordinances and neighborhood regulations from interfering with legally established agricultural operations. That includes noise complaints, aesthetic disputes, and yes, attempts to reclassify farms as commercial businesses just because they conduct basic agricultural trade. Maggie's face turned a shade of red that I didn't think was humanly possible. That's ridiculous. This is a residential community. Hale flipped through the papers before looking up at the police officers. Can you verify that Mr. Whitmore's homestead was established before this neighborhood was built? One of the officers, who had already been briefed by the county earlier, nodded. Yes, sir. The homestead has been here for over 100 years. The neighborhood's HOA was formed much later. Hill looked at Maggie. Then by state law, this homestead has more legal standing here than your HOA. You could have heard a pin drop. Maggie was fuming. But that's not fair. These people didn't move here to live next to a barnyard. They want peace, cleanliness, order. Hale raised an eyebrow. And Mr. Whitmore wants to keep his legally protected homestead, which existed before any of you moved in. If your HOA wanted to avoid agricultural properties, it should have done better research before expanding into farm-adjacent land. Maggie actually stomped her foot like a child. This is insane. I've had to put up with the stench, the noise, and the eyesore of this farm for years. It's time it goes. Hale sighed, pulling out his tablet. Mrs. Sullivan, I'll remind you that filing false complaints against a legally protected agricultural property is considered harassment under the state's agricultural laws. Additionally, any attempt to restrict, interfere with, or disrupt its operation without just cause could result in civil penalties. Maggie paled. Civil penalties? Yes, Hale said. That means fines. Lawsuits. I could see the realization dawning on her. She had picked a fight she wasn't going to win. George Patterson, my longtime neighbor, and Ellen Brooks, who owned the local grocery store, had been watching from the sidewalk. Ellen shook her head. I told you, Maggie, that farm isn't going anywhere. George chuckled. Looks like you should have done your homework. Maggie stammered. But. No buts, Hale said, tucking his tablet away. You've crossed a line, Mrs. Sullivan. The state will be conducting an investigation into your actions. I suggest you prepare accordingly. I turned to the officers. Well, gentlemen, if that's all, I've got work to do. One of the cops smirked. I think you're in the clear, Mr. Whitmore. Keep up the good work. As I walked back toward my barn, I could hear Maggie sputtering in frustration. But I wasn't worried about her anymore. Willow Creek Estates might not have liked having a farm on its border, but the law was on my side. And Maggie Sullivan? She had just learned that the hard way. And possible liability for any financial damages Mr. Whitmore incurs due to these repeated false complaints. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Maggie, of course, refused to go down without one last ridiculous attempt to shift blame. This is corruption, she screamed, pointing at me. You paid these people off. You bribed them to protect your filthy farm. Richard Hale, to his credit, didn't even react to her outburst. He simply sighed and turned to the police officers. Officers, I believe we're done here. I'll be filing a formal complaint against Mrs. Sullivan for repeated malicious legal actions against this homestead. The Department of Agriculture will be in touch. One of the officers turned to Maggie. Ma'am, at this point, we strongly advise that you stop interfering with this property. Continuing down this path could lead to legal consequences. Maggie's face twisted into something between rage and disbelief. You can't be serious. Very serious, Hale said. And if you continue harassing Mr. Whitmore, we will have no choice but to escalate the matter. Maggie lost it. She launched into a tirade of complaints, accusations, and increasingly wild conspiracy theories about how I was somehow tricking the government into backing me up. But no one was listening anymore. Hale, the officers, and even the neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle had all checked out. Finally, one of the officers sighed. All right, ma'am, I think we're done here. We're going to have to ask you to leave the property. Maggie opened her mouth to argue, but the other officer cut in. If you refuse, we'll have to file a formal trespassing complaint. Maggie's jaw snapped shut so hard I thought her teeth might crack. She turned on her heel and stormed back toward her house. I let out a slow breath, watching her retreat. Richard Hale turned to me, shaking his head. People like that never learn, huh? Never, I agreed. Hale gave me a firm nod. I'll be in touch soon. If she causes you any more problems, let me know. Will do. And thanks. With that, Hale and the officers left, leaving me standing in the middle of my homestead, finally able to breathe easy. But as I watched Maggie stomp up her driveway, one thought crossed my mind. This might be over for now, but knowing her, she wasn't done yet. Maggie's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. Gone was the smugness, the air of superiority. Now, she stood frozen in place, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Wait, hold on, she stammered, turning back toward the officers. I called you here. You're supposed to be handling him, not me. Richard Hale, the agricultural protection officer, remained completely unfazed. Mrs. Sullivan, your complaints have been investigated, and they hold no legal merit. However, your continued interference with this homestead is a separate matter, one that falls under my department's jurisdiction. Maggie's face turned an impressive shade of red. That's ridiculous. You work for the state. The state can't just barge into a private neighborhood and start making threats. Hale sighed, pulling out a small official booklet from his briefcase. Mrs. Sullivan, this is the Right to Farm Act, a legally binding document that protects established homesteads like Mr. Whitmore's from unlawful interference. He flipped to a page and pointed at a highlighted section. It explicitly states that any individual or entity that knowingly obstructs, disrupts, or harasses a legally recognized farm can face civil penalties, and, if damages are proven, criminal charges. Maggie froze. See criminal charges? The officers nodded grimly. Ma'am, you filed multiple false reports against this property, attempted to manipulate zoning laws under fraudulent pretenses, and knowingly interfered with a protected agricultural operation. That's more than enough grounds for an official investigation. Maggie stumbled back, clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of legal shield. You can't be serious. I was only trying to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood. I was doing my duty. Hale didn't even flinch. Your duty has resulted in repeated legal complaints, misuse of emergency resources, and attempted property interference. Maggie whipped around toward the gathered neighbors. You see this? This is what we're dealing with. This farm is ruining our community. Are you really just going to stand there and let this happen? There was a long, awkward silence. Then, George Patterson, the retired military officer who had lived in Willow Creek Estates for years, stepped forward. Maggie, he said in a level voice, James has never done anything to harm this neighborhood. I serve my country to protect people's rights, and I know when someone is being targeted unfairly. This farm belongs here. Ellen Brooks, the longtime local shop owner, nodded. I've lived here for decades, and I've seen this farm feed our town. You've taken this too far, Maggie. Maggie looked at them in disbelief. You can't be serious. But it was clear she had lost. The support she thought she had was crumbling before her eyes. Her face twisted in frustration, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned sharply and marched back toward her house, slamming the door behind her. Richard Hale turned to me. Seems like you have more friends in this neighborhood than she does. I exhaled. Took them long enough. He chuckled. That's how it goes sometimes. If she causes any more trouble, let me know immediately. We'll make sure she understands that the law is on your side. I nodded. Appreciate it. As the officers and Hale left, I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle over my homestead. The sun was setting over the orchard, the animals were calm, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. Maggie might have been done for now, but I had no doubt she'd try something again. The difference was, this time, I wasn't alone. Neighbors stood in awkward silence as Maggie Sullivan, her face twisted with frustration, tried to rally them to her side. You all saw this. He's ruining our community. He's making this place unlivable. We need to stand together. But instead of the chorus of agreement she expected, there was only hesitation. A few exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, George Patterson, a retired military officer and longtime resident, stepped forward. Maggie, you've gone too far. Maggie's face twitched. Excuse me. This homestead was here long before we moved in, he continued. And let's be honest, you've been harassing James for years. You call the cops over every little thing. You make outrageous demands, and now you're filing false complaints. Another neighbor, Ellen Brooks, crossed her arms. We moved here for peace, Maggie. But ever since you started acting like the neighborhood dictator, all you do is create problems where there aren't any. Maggie looked genuinely betrayed. You don't understand. I was trying to protect property values. I was. Property values? George scoffed. Maggie, my home's value has dropped since you started running things like a police state. You fine people for leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes late. You threatened to tow legally parked cars. And now this. Maggie spun back to the officers. You can't punish me for trying to keep order. Richard Hale, the state agricultural inspector, wasn't finished. Miss Sullivan, we're filing an official report on your unlawful actions against this homestead. The Department of Agriculture will be contacting you regarding fines and potential legal proceedings. Additionally, based on what we've heard today, there may be cause for further investigation into the HOA's financial management. Maggie's eyes widened. What do you mean? One of the officers, visibly fed up, pulled out a notepad. We've received multiple complaints about your conduct as the de facto HOA leader. This might go beyond interfering with a protected homestead. We'll be looking into how you've been running things. Maggie's entire body went rigid. And then, as if fate had a sense of humor, a third police cruiser pulled into the driveway. A younger officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, and approached the group. Sorry to interrupt, but we just got confirmation from the county clerk's office. They flagged some irregularities in the HOA's financial filings. We need to bring in M. Sullivan for questioning. Maggie paled. What? What? The senior officer sighed. Miss Sullivan, we're going to need you to come with us. She stumbled back, clutching her clipboard like a shield. No, this is a mistake. You should be arresting him. She pointed wildly at James, but no one was listening. The officers stepped forward. Maggie let out an enraged screech. You can't do this. I am the HOA president. Not anymore, George muttered. Maggie tried to fight it, but it was over. The officers cuffed her right there. Her angry protests fell on deaf ears as the entire neighborhood watched in stunned silence. As they escorted her to the police cruiser, she turned to James, her face a mask of pure fury. You ruined everything. James smiled. No, Maggie. You did that all by yourself. As the police cruisers pulled away, a few neighbors started clapping. George turned to James, shaking his head. Guess she finally pushed too far. Guess so, James said with a shrug. And here I thought I was the one in trouble. Richard Hale chuckled. Sometimes people bury themselves. You just have to stand back and let them dig. Maggie was gone. The HOA was under official scrutiny. And for the first time in years, James' homestead was completely safe. For the first time in years, he felt free. One important lesson from James Whitmore's story is the value of standing up for one's rights, especially in the face of overreach and unjust authority. James inherited his land and had every legal right to farm it. Yet he was pressured and harassed by an HOA that had no jurisdiction over his property. His persistence, knowledge of the law, and willingness to seek help ensured that justice was served. This story reminds us that knowing our rights is crucial, no matter our age. Too often, people in positions of authority try to impose rules where they have no power, assuming that others will comply out of fear or confusion. James' experience teaches us that staying informed and standing firm can prevent unnecessary hardship. For older adults, this is especially important. Whether dealing with local regulations, financial matters, or even family disputes, confidence and knowledge are key. If something doesn't seem right, question it. Seek advice. And most importantly, don't let anyone intimidate you into giving up what is rightfully yours. Strength isn't just about physical power. It's about wisdom, resilience, and the courage to hold your ground when it matters most.